So we can clearly see the stages, the 4 stages, and we can see the steps within the stage, okay? Transmission stage and the distribution stage each have 2 steps. We can see that. But let's take a closer look at the step stations themselves. Step stations. Each step station will have a transformer. Each individual transformer has a primary side, a coil, and a secondary side, a coil. The transformer design actually facilitates stage or step change. That's the key point. The transformer actually is what makes a change happen just by being there. The pre-transmission step station will always step up the voltage. The pre-transmission step station and the post-transmission step station will straddle 2 stages. They do so because stage change occurs within a transformer. More precisely, between the primary and the secondary coils. Some systems might not incorporate the transmission step station, that's a step down. Therefore, the transmission stage in that system will not have steps. The transmission step station is the only station that can be excluded from any given EPT system. If the transmission step station were excluded, the only stage in a given system that would have steps would be the distribution stage. We'll talk about that in a minute. Each neutral, which I call median or balancing conductor, you can see my other videos, originates in a step station, but only on the secondary side of the transformer. And we'll talk about that too. I try not to use the prefix sub in the terms that I devised for EPT, my own system, my own way of envisioning the transfer of electric power. For example, my transmission step station, which lies in the heart of the transmission stage, is traditionally referred to as the sub-transmission substation. Personally, when it comes to electrical terminology, I shy away from the prefix sub. Sub is ordinarily defined as such: subdivision of, subordinate, secondary, next lower than or inferior to. See, that's the common definition that you'll see out there. The problem here is that when speaking of EPT, sub doesn't really tell us anything meaningful. If you think this through, you'll discover, as I did, that sub just doesn't cut it. For the set of transmission step stations, there's 3 of them, I prefer pre and post. These prefixes at least tell us a little something about the stations or transformers. For example, post, the definition would be after, subsequent, following. In accord with my AC current flow series of videos, I hold fast to the term station. I devised the circuit station system, which you might call residential electric service. I call it the circuit station system. In that system, my personal way of envisioning, okay, it's my own personal way of looking at things, I have stations, and there are 6 in total. The stations reside on a station circuit. It's really very simple and easy to understand. All in all, I think that step station fits in nicely with my other electrical station concepts. So we have electric power transfer. All right, I prefer the word transfer over transmission, which I save for one of the names of the stages. So you have your generation, transmission, distribution, and user. Those are the stages. Within the transmission stage and the distribution stage, you'll see steps. The primary step and the secondary step. See primary step here, secondary step. Now, the step station here is actually a physical location, but it's also a transformer here. Now, I call this transformer here the pre-transmission step station or transformer, okay? Pre-transmission. In other words, you're entering into the transmission stage of the whole system. Now, right here in the middle, in the heart of the system, okay, you have your transmission step station with no prefix, and that's a transformer here, right? Then finally, you have your post-transmission step station. So you have 3 step stations with the word transmission because they are all connected, affiliated, and part of the transmission stage. That's very, very simple. Some people will refer to this station as a sub-transmission station. I don't like that. I've already touched on that. I just don't like that term. It doesn't tell us anything here, right? Then when you get to the distribution stage, all right, you have a transformer here. And in that transformer, on the secondary side of the transformer, you have a Y configuration. It's spelled W-Y-E, and that's how we get our first neutral. All right, it comes from the very center of this configuration, and that's how you get your first neutral. I made videos on this, and I try to explain this in my terms, my very simple way of looking at electric. So your first neutral is produced here. It's created here. Right? Then you get to the distribution transformer. All right? Very simple. It's in the heart of the distribution stage, so we call it as such. All right? Now, that's the one you ordinarily see outside on a pole, or you'll see it in a box. It's called a pad-mounted transformer. You'll see that on the ground somewhere. But we're familiar with this, and that's where you get your second neutral. That neutral is created because it comes from the very center of that secondary coil in the transformer. That's how you get your other neutral. These 2 neutrals are not physically connected in the transformer. The only way they're connected is they are connected to ground somewhere, and that's only for safety reasons. All right? So then finally you have a service point. That's really just kind of a splice, a connection of your cables and conductors up in the air. And it's not really a box or a transformer. It's just a point. It's a very critical point in the system. So that's your service point. Now, I wanted to tell you this quickly. The distribution stage has 2 steps, primary and secondary. Sometimes you'll see outside, and I say that because I walked several miles here where I live in central Pennsylvania. I walked mile after mile and actually looked at the transformers, and I looked at all of the conductors, like hundreds of them, and you'll see something. Sometimes the distribution secondary step, all right, that's the part from your distribution transformer that you see up there and the service point at your house. Sometimes you'll see that coming off of that transformer, you'll see a group of 3 conductors, and they just run out from pole to pole, and I call it a feeder step. Most people call this a secondary or a secondary main. That's what they call them, secondary mains. That just doesn't tell me anything. I don't like those terms, those phrases. So I call it just a feeder step because it's feeding, all right? It's feeding these service drops wherever they might occur. In other words, you'll see up here when you get to a point where your service drop is connected, you'll see that these conductors are bundled. They're wrapped around each other, and it's called a triplex. Some people call it a triplex or just a bundle. But sometimes you'll see that there's a feeder step. You'll see 3 conductors stacked on top of each other neatly. You'll see them up there. But if you don't see this, if you don't see that feeder step, then you'll have a secondary step that is not divided. Okay, all you'll have is primary and secondary. So I hope that makes sense.